every people has a sense of history. If one reads Thucydides, for example, as opposed to Herodotus, whom I enjoy, but Herodotus is, I think, not in the same league in terms of a concept of history as Thucydides. Thucydides is, in fact, a miracle. When you read Thucydides, who's writing about the Peloponnesian War, the history of the Peloponnesian War, you can't tell that he's not a modern man. He thinks in an incredibly modern way. But he's also committed to the changeless order of things. He thinks in essentialist terms. So he understands change against the backdrop of what is changeless. This is the classic idea of Greek thought. I mean, Parmenides had set this dreadful problem, in a sense, that it looked as if the changing world was not real. So the whole problem of science, as Aristotle would have seen it, would be pointless, since science is concerned with explaining processes of change. So they needed, and Plato for other reasons in terms of his political and moral concerns of practical nature, which are also embedded in the changing world, a belief as well. They had to reconcile the changing world with the changeless world in some way, which is what was, in a sense, the heart of classical Greek thought. Now, I've suggested that at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th, it began to dawn on theorists that what we call the changeless world is itself a construction from the changing world. That's a radical idea. And in fact, there was a very important pragmatist who wrote in 1923, if I'm not mistaken, C.I. Lewis, wrote a famous paper, it's a brilliant paper, a pragmatist conception of the a priori, I think he calls it, in which he says exactly what I'm now reporting, that the a priori, which is at that time looked at as, and not today, looked at as changeless regularities, necessary and changeless order of things, is to be construed as a projection of what looks changeless to us from this vantage of speculation. He doesn't discuss history there, but I think that the idea is that with changes in history, we see that we need different projections of what we regard as the changeless frame of reference of our changing world. I think this is also related in a different way to Tom Kuhn's idea of shifting from one paradigm to another. To propose a new paradigm for science is a little bit like projecting a new a priori for the a posteriori inquiries of run-of-the-mill scientists, you might say. And in the case of Dewey, it's completely eliminated because all the proposals are provisional and changing relative to the changing world, and there's nothing fixed from Dewey's point of view, which is the radical aspect of what he was getting at. Now, the point I need to make is the following, and it's a terminological point. It's not history that we need. It's the concept of historicity. Historicity is the idea that thinking itself has a historical structure. History is a narrative, the idea of a narrative account of events in time. That is to say, the narrative is deployed in time. Something happens over a period of time. But history doesn't tell you anything about the theory of history, whereas historicity is in fact a theory of historical time, that it has the character of forming and transforming human thinking in a way which cannot be understood except in terms of some a historical projection. That is, the forms of thinking themselves change with changing history. Marx made this point, following Lewis Morgan, as a matter of fact, that the change is due to technological changes. Change the technology of production, says Marx, and you change thinking. I think he agreed with this idea of historicity, and that is to say that Marx was a Hegelian. It's Hegel's idea that there is a kind of spirit or Geist which dominates large spans of historical life, and that the spirits of these periods keep changing. They evolve from one another over time. And therefore, the human beings who think and work in those ages think in different ways. That explains, for example, Hegel's lectures on fine art, in which he talks about the different spirits of art in different worlds and in different periods. We can't handle such an extravagant idiom as Hegel's. We need to reduce it to something more manageable. And I think what I'm calling historicity is, in fact, just that theme. But in fact, it's historicity that's missing from American thinking. American thinking is ahistorical in the sense in which it will allow history, but it never touches historicity. And that's what we're missing. And that means to say it's an idea which was introduced at about 200 years ago. And for some reason, it never caught on in America. There was a period when, of course, America was influenced by Marxist thinking in the 1930s, for example, in the Depression years. And so something of Marxist historicism was, in fact, an ingredient in American life, but with the defeat of Marxism in America, which pretty well came to its end long before the defeat of the Soviet Empire, history in that sense disappeared. It's also worth saying that Rorty is interested in historicism. And here it seems to me he has the advantage of Putnam. And he does point in a direction which is fruitful, but he himself then, true to his own so-called postmodernist colors, doesn't want to take responsibility for building it into an improved kind of form of inquiry, because he doesn't believe, he says, in the validity of that kind of sustained inquiry, and he's prepared to dismiss it. For all of these reasons, it seems to me, American pragmatism has been stalemated for no damn good reason. And it seems to me that a fruitful recovery of the tradition, which frankly is part of my own project, if I may say so, but I don't mean that it's merely mine, it's just a way of, so to say, being the scout for a larger enterprise, that it's where the action is. And I think it's also the clue to recovering a sort of rapprochement among all the principal threads of Eurocentric thought.